Do you ever feel like you're just drowning in information, scrolling endlessly, catching bits and pieces, but never really getting that deep understanding?
Oh, absolutely. It's like the big picture stays blurry, right? There's just so much noise out there.
Exactly. So, welcome to the deep dive. Think of this as your shortcut to getting properly informed on a topic.
You sort through the noise for you.
You got it. And you sent over a really fascinating mix of sources this time. We've got global politics, economic shifts, social changes, kind of all over the map, but connected.
Yeah, the goal here is to pull out the key insights, connect the dots, and hopefully give you a few of those aha moments.
We're going to be your guides through this, pointing out the important stuff
Hmm.
and maybe some surprising turns along the way.
And what's really striking about these sources taken together is they show some pretty big shifts happening, like right now, across lots of different areas.
Yeah, we'll be digging into how global power is shifting,
Mhm.
what certain policies actually do, and even some subtle, kind of weird ways society's changing.
Definitely some surprising things in here. Changes in military tech, use, social habits, stuff you might not expect.
Okay, should we dive in?
Let's do it. First up, let's look at that recent military tension between India and Pakistan. The sources suggest this latest clash, well, it set some new precedents.
Right. What really jumped out at me was Pakistan using those advanced Chinese jets, the J-10Cs, and the missiles too, the PL-15s.
Exactly. That's a first, isn't it? Seeing that level of Chinese tech used directly against, a country mostly using Western gear.
And then Pakistan claimed they shot down 5 Indian fighters, including the Rafales.
Which is a huge claim, yeah, and India hasn't confirmed or denied losing any planes, so it's still a bit murky.
It definitely raises questions, though, about how these different technologies actually stack up against each other in a real situation.
For sure. And China's role here is interesting, too. They condemned the initial attack, but then called India's response regrettable.
So pretty clearly siding with Pakistan there.
Seems like it. It really highlights their position as Pakistan's key strategic backer, and maybe it's also about showcasing their own military tech.
We get demonstration.
Could be showing what their systems can do, potentially countering Western influence in the arms market.
And then you have the U.S. stepping in, that preemptive ceasefire announcement offering to mediate that apparently really surprised India.
Yeah, it seemed to throw India off, as one source put it. It feels like a different approach for the U.S. in this situation.
Why do you think they did that? A shift in how they see India?
That's one possibility. India is much more powerful now, strategically important, especially with China in the picture. So maybe the U.S. feels they can't just apply pressure like it used to.
They have to rely more on diplomacy, maybe incentives.
Exactly. Things like counterterrorism cooperation rather than just, laying down the law.
Mm.
It suggests American influence, while still there, isn't quite as absolute in this relationship anymore.
Fascinating. It really shows how these power dynamics are constantly shifting. Okay, sticking with that theme, let's talk China and Russia. The sources paint a picture that's less equal partners, more complicated.
Very much so. That analysis firm, Russia, they used a pretty strong word. They called China's economic relationship with Russia much more colonial now.
Colonial. Wow. Okay, what does that mean in practice?
Well, despite all the talk about friendship and opposing the U.S., it seems Xi Jinping really has Putin over a barrel, as the source says.
So China has the leverage.
It looks that way. Chinese investment in Russia is actually quite low, especially compared to how much Russia used to trade with the EU before the war.
Right, the EU was a huge partner for them.
Huge. And now Russia needs China for trade, but China isn't pouring in the kind of money that would really transform the Russian economy. It's more like China's the buyer,
Yeah.
setting the
Yeah,
terms.
diplomatically, they talk about opposing hegemonism.
Yeah, meaning the U.S., usually. But China keeps a bit of distance. They seem to want Russia stable, maybe even functional enough to keep the war going, but they're not, fully endorsing everything Russia does.
They don't want to risk their own ties with the West too much.
Precisely. It's a balancing act. They benefit from a dependent Russia, but they can't afford major Western sanctions themselves.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. Some sources suggest Russia might actually want better ties with the U.S., partly to be less reliant on China.
Yeah, that's a potential angle,
Hmm.
an alternative. But China, well, they seem to prefer keeping Russia dependent.
Why? What's in it for China?
Well, a dependent Russia is less likely to cozy up to the West, right? It's a reliable source of cheap resources. And it helps China push that narrative of a global shift away from U.S. dominance, even if the China-Russia relationship itself isn't equal at all.
It's a very strategic, almost cold calculation, isn't it?
It seems that way. Okay, let's pivot now. Let's look at some of the Trump administration policies and their global ripples, lifting sanctions on Syria, for example.
Right. What was the thinking there? Trump talked about giving Syria a chance at greatness, even met with President al-Shara.
Yeah, the focus seemed very specific. Trump apparently pushed for Syria to reconcile with Israel, kick out terrorist groups, deport Palestinian fighters,
It wasn't the focus.
human rights, democratic reforms, protecting minorities.
Ah.
Uh, those things didn't seem to be high on the agenda, according to the sources. Very transactional.
Okay. And economically, what did Syria think?
Their central bank governor saw it as a potential catalyst, for recovery.
Mm.
But he also stressed they urgently need to modernize their monetary policy, rebuild the financial system.
And reconnect internationally.
Exactly. And he specifically mentioned unifying the exchange rate.
What does that mean, unifying the exchange rate? Why is that so important?
Basically getting rid of the gap between the official rate and the black market rate. In Syria, that gap's been huge, causing all sorts of economic problems. Unifying it is seen as key to stabilizing things, getting investment back, making prices fair. But it's tricky to manage without causing more chaos.
Right. Okay, another big Trump policy area. The trade truce with China, that seemed like dialing things back a bit.
Temporarily, at least. It was a 90-day deal to cut those reciprocal tariffs, basically putting China on the same footing as countries that hadn't hit back against U.S. tariffs.
And China gave something in return.
Yeah, they reportedly agreed to lift their ban on Boeing plane deliveries, which is, a big deal for Boeing and for China's airlines.
And Treasury Secretary Bessent talked about aiming for strategic, not a general, decoupling. What's the difference?
Strategic decoupling is more targeted, like limiting trade just in sensitive areas, tech, defense, IP, where there are security worries or unfair practices, not cutting ties across the board.
So manage the risks without blowing up the whole relationship.
That seems to be the idea. But the sources also warn it might not last. Trump could change his mind, or maybe the pressure being off means China slows down on reforms. It's not necessarily a permanent fix.
A pause, maybe. Okay, shifting again, still with Trump policies. The executive order on drug prices. Try to force prices down.
That was the goal, yeah. Make companies lower U.S. prices to match what they charge in other wealthy countries. He was talking about huge cuts, like 59%, even 90% in some cases.
Really ambitious. But did it actually work? The source suggests there were problems.
Yeah, some major hurdles. For one thing, it didn't really account for generic drugs. Generics make up most prescriptions here, and they're often already cheaper in the U.S. than elsewhere.
So the order didn't quite fit the reality of the market.
Exactly. It didn't really distinguish between brand name and generics properly, which made it pretty difficult to implement effectively.
Okay, let's bring it home now. Look at some domestic U.S. policy debates. First, the Republican tax plan. Why is that back on the table?
Well, a lot of those 2017 tax cuts, the Trump ones, they're about to expire. Something has to be done. Plus, campaign promises and party policy goals.
But the cost, the impact on the national debt looks pretty massive.
It does. The Joint Committee on Taxation figures it could add about $3.7 trillion to the debt over 10 years. That's compared to just letting things expire.
Wow. What's driving that? Extending the old cuts.
Mostly, yeah. Extending things like the higher standard deduction, the child tax credit, and there's some new things too, like getting rid of taxes on tips and overtime pay.
And not everyone's thrilled about the fiscal impact. Mark Goldwein called it a dumpster fire.
Yeah, that's quite a description. Goldwein's from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. His point, and the criticism from others, is basically, where's the money coming from?
They're saying the plan doesn't pay for itself.
Right. The proposed spending cuts apparently don't come close to covering the cost of the tax cuts. So the worry is bigger deficits, more debt, maybe higher interest rates down the line.
Okay, another hot topic, Medicaid work requirements. What's the argument for them?
Proponents say it's about two things: cutting government spending and pushing people into the workforce. The House plan, for example, would require most adults on Medicaid to work or train or volunteer for 80 hours a month.
But what about the impact on people losing their health insurance? That's the big worry, isn't it?
Absolutely. The CBO is the Congressional Budget Office. They estimate that this, along with other Medicaid changes, could mean about 8.6 million fewer people insured by 2034.
8.6 million. That's a lot of people.
It is, and there are real questions about whether people who lose coverage can actually meet those requirements, due to health issues, lack of childcare, transport problems. Plus, remember that experiment in Arkansas?
Vaguely. It didn't go well.
It was described as messy. A lot of people lost coverage, but it didn't seem to lead to a big jump in employment. So there's a track record there that raises concerns.
Yeah, definitely highlights the risk of unintended consequences. Okay, let's shift to something more positive domestically. Violent crime seems to be falling.
Yes, that's a welcome trend reported in the sources. And some cities are seeing really significant drops. Baltimore, for instance, fewer homicides.
Is Baltimore unique, or is this happening elsewhere too?
No, it seems to be a broader trend. Crime falling in many cities across the U.S.
And Baltimore's approach is interesting. It's not just policing, right? It involves therapy, job training.
Yeah, working with young men who are involved in the justice system, often through community groups. It's a more holistic approach.
Trying to tackle the root causes.
That's the idea. Lack of opportunity, trauma, things like that. Trying to break the cycle. But there's a catch.
Oh.
The sources mention potential threats to this kind of model. Federal funding cuts and a shift in focus towards mass deportations could pull resources away from these community programs.
So progress could be fragile. Okay, let's pivot to social and cultural norms. Free speech in Europe and Britain. Seems like there's some unease there.
There definitely is. The sources point to, well, a growing number of cases where people are getting arrested or facing legal trouble for things they post online.
For online posts, like what?
Criticizing public figures, commenting on sensitive topics like immigration, sometimes even questioning school policies. It seems these hate speech laws are being interpreted quite broadly.
What's the goal of these laws supposed to be?
Officially, it's about protecting people, promoting harmony, stopping incitement. But the debate is whether they're going too far, stifling legitimate debate or criticism.
Creating a chilling effect.
Potentially. Some argue that pushing controversial opinions underground doesn't actually help. It might even make divisions worse by shutting down dialogue. And then there's the EU's Digital Services Act, the DSA, which could have a big impact too.
Right. Okay, staying in the UK, let's talk immigration. There seems to be a weird disconnect between the economics and the politics.
Yeah, it's striking. You have the Prime Minister sometimes pointing out the economic benefits, trying to counter the narrative that things are out of control. But politically, the focus is often very negative.
Why is that, do you think, if it's economically beneficial?
It could be lots of things. Cultural anxiety, worries about services, or maybe it's just, politically useful to sound tough on borders. But the sources seem pretty clear. Overall, liberal immigration policies have actually been good for the UK economy, even if politically tricky.
Interesting. Now, here's a surprise. Less weekend drunken violence in Britain.
Apparently so. A noticeable drop, especially among young men.
What's driving that? People drinking less?
That seems to be a big part of it. More young adults are just not drinking alcohol at all. Maybe it's health awareness, changing social norms, maybe spending more time online instead of in pubs.
A cultural shift.
Seems like it. Though, interestingly, while alcohol-fueled fights might be down, the sources note that assaults with knives haven't really dropped. So it's complicated.
Okay, let's head east now. AI chatbots in China. People are forming relationships with them.
Yeah, it's a growing thing. Young people forming real emotional bonds with AI companions. They chat, play games, get emotional support.
Why is this happening? Loneliness?
That's likely part of it. Modern life pressures, maybe.
Well,
And the AI is getting really sophisticated, very human-like.
yeah,
But there's a potential downside.
let me guess. Birth rates.
You got it. China's birth rate is already super low. If people are finding companionship, even emotional fulfillment, with AI, does that reduce the incentive to form human relationships, start families? It's a concern raised in the sources.
Wow. Okay, on a possibly more positive relationship note, fatherhood seems to be changing in richer countries.
Yes, definitely. Dads are spending significantly more time on childcare than they used to.
What's behind that?
Probably a mix of things. Reliable contraception plays a role. Women's education and earning power means more expectation of sharing the load and just, evolving ideas about what it means to be a good dad. More active involvement is valued now.
That sounds like a good trend. And speaking of positive trends, the WNBA is apparently booming.
Yeah, the numbers are really impressive. Viewership is way up, almost doubled, and they're expecting a huge media rights deal soon.
Why is the surge now?
Seems like increased visibility is key. More games on major networks, streaming. It's just easier to watch. Plus good marketing, highlighting the stars. It's becoming much more mainstream.
Great to see. Okay, final section. Emerging trends, new innovations. First, the Trump family and crypto. What's happening there?
Well, there's been a bunch of crypto stuff linked to them. Trump and P coins, even a meme coin tied to Melania Trump. Highly volatile, as you'd expect.
And Trump himself has direct crypto interests.
Yeah, through his Trump media and technology groups, there's a direct financial stake.
And this is raising eyebrows. Conflicts of interest.
That's the concern.
Yeah.
Are people buying these coins just to speculate, or is it like a way to buy influence or show support? It blurs lines.
Like selling access, almost.
That's the accusation from critics. And it might actually be hurting the wider crypto industry's attempts to get clearer rules and, bipartisan support in Washington. Being so tied to one political figure makes it harder.
Yeah, I can see that. Okay, totally different kind of tech, gene editing. Tell us about this KJ case.
This is really groundbreaking stuff. KJ is the first person treated with a totally custom-made CRISPR therapy. Yeah, doctors basically designed a gene editing drug just for him to fix his specific genetic mutation.
Yeah.
And they did it incredibly fast.
Wow, that's personalized medicine on a whole new level.
Exactly. It shows the amazing potential of CRISPR to maybe one day treat all sorts of genetic diseases that were untreatable before. The speed of development was just stunning.
Feels like science fiction becoming reality.
It really does. It's a glimpse of the future.
Okay, back to the present, but still innovative in its own way. Walmart. They seem to be doing really well.
Surprisingly well, yeah, and considering all the global economic weirdness. They're financially strong, and their international business is particularly interesting.
How so?
In some places, like China and India, Walmart isn't just seen as a cheap discount store. It's actually perceived as more of a premium brand.
Really? Walmart as premium?
Yeah, it shows how well they've adapted to different markets and consumer tastes around the world. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Impressive adaptability. Okay, one last quick hit. 6th-generation fighter jets. What's the thinking behind those?
The concepts emerging suggest they'll be bigger jets, with a real focus on flying further longer range and being even stealthier, harder to spot.
Bigger, longer range, stealthier. Anything else?
Yeah, a key idea is that they won't just operate alone. They're designed to be like the quarterback for a whole fleet of drones, controlling unmanned aircraft, acting as a flying command center.
So it's about the network, not just the plane itself.
Exactly. It's a shift towards this integrated combat air system, a big change in how air power might work.
Wow. Okay, we have definitely covered a ton of ground. That was quite the deep dive.
It really was, from geopolitics and military tech to domestic policy debates, social shifts, crypto, gene editing. It's a lot.
And what really stands out, I think, is how interconnected it all is. Like a decision about sanctions in Syria connects to global economics, which connects to maybe how people feel about immigration.
Totally. You can't really understand one piece in isolation. The trade tensions affect tech development, which affects social media use, which maybe ties back to those AI chatbots.
Yeah.
It's all linked.
And digging into the details was fascinating. The specific Chinese jets, the colonial description of the Russia relationship, the fact generics are already cheap here. Those nuances really change the picture.
Yeah, moving past the headlines is crucial. Seeing the whole landscape, not just isolated events.
So hopefully for you listening, this has helped connect some of those dots and given you a clearer perspective.
We hope so.
And maybe one final thing for you to chew on. Given how linked everything is, think about how something happening, say, geopolitically, might have totally unexpected ripple effects in your world. Your job, your community, maybe even the tech you use.
That's a great point. Those second and third order effects are often the most surprising and maybe the most important to anticipate.
Definitely something to think about. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, hope it was insightful.
We hope we've armed you with some new knowledge and maybe sparked some new questions. Until next time.